The CCP is covering up COVID again. Taiwan sends military equipment to be repaired in China, and the US has a dangerously close encounter with an aggressive Chinese jet. That and more on this week's China News headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Incogni. You probably know that companies are collecting your personal data, but you may not realize just how many. Dozens, maybe hundreds, most of which you've never heard of, and you have no idea what they're doing with it. Incogni helps stop them. I'll explain more at the end. Incogni is a great company. What isn't a great company is Shinra, the evil corporation destroying the planet in Final Fantasy VII. For more on that, check out the latest episode of our new channel, Gamers Unbeaten, Shinra, the ultimate big tech monopoly. Link is below. So, the Chinese Communist Party abruptly ended its zero COVID policy in December. That means allowing, even forcing people to go back to work, opening up travel, encouraging people to get back to normal. You know, the way it's been for a long time in the rest of the world. The problem is the Chinese regime is now flying blind. See, the Chinese Communist Party didn't just open up and go, let's see what happens. They opened up and are specifically trying to cover up what happens. The biggest problem is the country is collecting and sharing far too little data. Basically, the Chinese Communist Party wants to show how great they are at handling COVID. So they're trying to keep the official death count low. To do that, China has been counting COVID deaths differently than other countries. Like in China, if someone has COVID, but they also have diabetes, the cause of death will be listed as diabetes, and COVID won't even be mentioned. Most countries, if anything, have counted things the opposite way. If you died from anything while sick from COVID, it was counted as a COVID death. The point is, most people consider China's official COVID death toll laughably low. And this is actually making it hard for Chinese officials to plan for effective care. Like if the death rate is officially low, local authorities can't justify putting more resources into hospitals, which might explain why so many hospitals are absolutely jam-packed, and there are not enough doctors and nurses to help. And that actually leads to more people dying, which then fuels the need for a bigger cover-up. And remember, the cover-up in early 2020 is precisely why China was not able to contain the spread of COVID to just Wuhan. As a result, COVID spread around the world, and we all lost 2 years of our lives. If not to COVID, then at least to the pandemic of endless Zoom meetings. So how bad is COVID in China? We still don't know. The World Health Organization is saying China underreports deaths, but at least there's no new COVID variant. Well, no new variant that the WHO knows of. And it can't know everything because China is underreporting deaths. So, by how much is the Chinese regime undercounting deaths? Leaked notes from Chinese health officials estimate there were a shocking 250 million COVID-19 infections in just the first 20 days of December. That number comes from a closed-door meeting of Chinese officials. The document was leaked on the internet. It has not been verified. What is for sure is that 250 million cases would be a lot more than what's reported in public data. Just 63,000. So at least we can feel confident that there is a cover-up. Don't ever change, you. People inside China know there's a cover-up too. Not just because their hospitals are insanely crowded and their morgues are overflowing, but also because the worst possible thing is happening. Chinese celebrities are dying. And there's too much of that to be a coincidence. In the past few weeks, a slew of obituaries published by companies, institutes, schools, and families has undermined the official narrative that the outbreak is under control. Plus, the term white lung has been spreading across Chinese social media. White lung refers to the color of lungs on a CT scan. Normally, lungs appear black, but when they look white, it means there's inflammation, which causes excessive fluid to build up. So, what's the solution to white lung? Internet censors swooped in to scrub discussions of the phenomenon. problem solved. In some ways, though, Chinese censors have had to end their crackdown on people complaining about COVID because there's just so much to complain about. Now, Chinese internet users are allowed to complain a little bit, but not about the Chinese Communist Party. It's definitely not the party's fault for covering up COVID in 2020, or locking people in their homes for months under zero COVID, or changing zero COVID suddenly right before winter started because the economy was cratering and COVID was already surging anyway. No, don't blame the Chinese Communist Party. You know who you should blame? Protesters. Remember back in November when people across China protested the Communist Party's zero COVID restrictions? They held up blank pieces of paper because criticism of the government is illegal. Well, they're in trouble now, because China's censorship and propaganda apparatus is moving to shift the blame to them. You know, to people who were wearing masks outdoors. Those who called for changes are facing much of the blame, even as those at the top who ordered the changes have remained relatively shielded from criticism, which is exactly how it's supposed to work in a communist country. But despite there being a big, possibly massive outbreak in China, the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely fine with people leaving China and flying to other countries. I'll have more on that after the break. Welcome back. Despite, and hopefully not because of, the massive COVID outbreak in China, the Chinese Communist Party is encouraging people to travel around the world again. That includes other countries/regions like Taiwan. On New Year's Day, nearly 28% of airplane passengers from mainland China tested positive for COVID. Taiwan asked them to quarantine for at least 5 days. But that's not the point. The point is, why are so many people with COVID traveling out of China? Meanwhile, many Western countries, including the US, France, and Italy, are requiring mainland Chinese visitors to test negative for COVID before getting on the plane. And if you think that's a good idea, you're completely wrong. According to my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, they explained that COVID checks on Chinese travelers lay bare our Western hypocrisy and extreme bad faith. The article explains how Western countries already declared the pandemic was over, and therefore forcing Chinese tourists to take a COVID test must be motivated by underlying racism and xenophobia. Please conveniently forget how just this past summer, most Chinese cities were forcing all residents to take COVID tests every 2 to 3 days if they wanted to leave their home to do literally anything, including taking a bus or shopping at a grocery store. And please also conveniently forget that early in the pandemic, the Chinese Communist Party banned most foreign arrivals to China. They didn't merely require testing, they just put a blanket ban on foreigners. And last year, China blocked entire flights after a small number of passengers on earlier flights tested positive for COVID. Plus, right now, China still requires a negative COVID test within 48 hours before flying into the country. You know, literally the same exact thing China is complaining about other countries doing. And that's the trick to understanding Chinese state-run media. Everything they accuse other countries of doing are things the Chinese Communist Party does even worse. Speaking of things Chinese state-run media says, U.S. attempts to precipitate trouble in the South China Sea won't succeed. But unfortunately, what might succeed are the CCP's attempts to stir up trouble in the South China Sea. Because a few days before Christmas, a Chinese Navy jet flew within 10 feet of a U.S. Air Force plane over the South China Sea. This is actual footage shot from the U.S. plane. With jets cruising at several hundred miles an hour, you can imagine how incredibly dangerous this is. It's like Top Gun, except a mistake could trigger World War III. A big reason that U.S. jet was patrolling the South China Sea was to signal to China that the U.S. military is prepared to defend Taiwan. Taiwan is also taking its own steps to bolster self-defense. What's not so great is when Taiwan has to get its military equipment repaired in China. What happened is an instrument used to launch Taiwan's anti-ship missiles needed to be fixed. So it was sent to Switzerland by the company that had supplied it, but then they sent it to a maintenance center in China to make the actual repair. Which means China is such a major part of the global supply chain that the country China plans to invade has to rely on China for its military equipment. The people involved said they had removed all the memory cards, though, so there were no concerns over possible information leaks. But that shouldn't even be a thing you have to clarify. And after the break, Hong Kong gets help from Beijing to prosecute a dissident. Welcome back. For more than 2 years, we've been following the case of Jimmy Lai. He's the CEO of the pro-democracy Hong Kong newspaper Apple Daily. Or he was until the Hong Kong government forced him to shut it down and arrested him under the national security law, because nothing threatens China's national security like democracy. Lai has asked a British lawyer to represent him at his trial, which makes sense because Hong Kong's legal system is based on British common law. Also, Lai is a UK citizen. But now, Beijing has ruled that nope, Lai can't use that foreign lawyer after all. It's actually worse than that, because the Hong Kong courts had actually allowed Jimmy Lai's lawyer. But then Hong Kong's chief executive John Lee got involved and asked Beijing for help interpreting the law. So officials from the very top of the Chinese Communist Party told Lee, don't worry about it, we'll give you legal permission to stop this. This is what Beijing calls one country, two systems. That's where in mainland China, defendants are not allowed fair representation, whereas in Hong Kong, defendants are also not allowed fair representation, but under a different set of laws. See? Two systems. Possibly some good news in Hong Kong, though. Remember Cardinal Joseph Zen, the Catholic official who has been sympathetic to people having freedom? We interviewed him when we were there in 2019. He was arrested last year, also under Hong Kong's national security law. They confiscated his passport. But now that the former Pope Benedict XVI has passed away, authorities returned his passport temporarily so he could leave Hong Kong and fly to the Vatican to attend the funeral this week. No word yet on whether he'll decide to fly back. And this episode is sponsored by Incogni. Whenever you do anything online, there's a huge number of companies that collect your personal data. Your name, your email, your home address, your credit card info, and lots more. That's why I signed up for Incogni. When I signed up in February 2022, I discovered there were dozens of data brokers that potentially had my private information. And that means companies are buying and selling my personal info. That makes it easier for companies and governments to track me. And even worse, because that data is now out there, it can be hacked. Data breaches have been on the rise over the past year, which means my personal information is at risk now more than ever. Fortunately, Incogni has been forcing these companies to delete my data. As of today, Incogni has already gotten my details removed from 86 of these data brokers, with a lot more in progress. And I didn't actually have to do anything after signing up. Incogni just handles it. So I recommend you get Incogni for yourself. Click the link below or go to incogni.com/uncensored. And the first 100 people to use the code uncensored will get 20% off. Get your personal data off the market with Incogni. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.